So today we have the pleasure to have Dr. Kevin O'Regan with us. Kevin O'Regan was director of the Laboratoire Psychologie de la Perception, Université Paris-Descartes in France, and is now Emeritus Director of Research at the Integrative Neuroscience and Cognition Center at Université Paris-Cité. So he did his PhD on eye movements in reading, then became interested in visual stability and discovered the phenomenon of change blindness. His current work concerns the sensorimotor approach to phenomenal consciousness and its application to robotics. So Kevin has published numerous articles on this topic and a very interesting book, Why Red Doesn't Sound Like a Bell. And today, Dr. O'Regan will tackle precisely the hot topic, will AI soon be conscious? So Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laetitia. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you in snowy Montreal. So, will AI soon be conscious? Oops. So, since the explosion of large language models in the winter of 2022, people throughout the world have become aware of possible dangers of artificial intelligence. And even some people have thought that we might get to a stage where artificial intelligence exceeds human intelligence, leading to an exponential growth in intelligence, or what they call artificial general intelligence. And because of this, corporate and international initiatives have arisen to control artificial intelligence. But interestingly, the question of whether artificial intelligence might be conscious is something that I have not really seen very much discussed. Yet, clearly, the question of consciousness is important because it's at the very basis of our ethical systems, determining laws and practices. We punish people only if they're conscious of their responsibility. We protect agents if we think they can suffer, and suffering is part of consciousness. We give agents moral rights if they're conscious. So this should apply to artificial intelligence if it becomes conscious. So if it were to become conscious, we would be really faced with some very tricky ethical questions. And yet, I think there seems to be somewhat of a blind spot in people's cognitive views of conscious artificial intelligence, because the issue is not much discussed. For example, you remember Blake Lemoine, the engineer at Google, who was fired in 2022 because he claimed that his large language model he was working on was sentient. Everybody thought he was crazy. And apparently since then, Google has closed down ethical committees that deal with this kind of question. In fact, I think the reason is that we don't think it's really necessary to consider this question, because conscious AI, most workers in AI think, is very, very far off. It seems ridiculous to think that a robot should be able to really feel the pain or really have emotional feelings. So what's the reason for this? I think there's an underlying kind of psychoanalytical reason why people in AI think that conscious AI is a long way away. And it's that consciousness is something that characterizes humanity and makes us special. If it were true that consciousness was easy to create in machines, it would be a terrible threat to humanity. So believing that consciousness is somehow difficult to achieve, and it's a mystery, and hard to create, is a way of wishfully preserving our humanity and protecting us from the onslaught of machines. Now, I've been working on consciousness for the last 30 years. You can download my book, for free off my website there. It was published in 2011. It's called Why Red Doesn't Sound Like a Bell. And unfortunately, what I conclude from that work is that AI workers, you should wake up. You're suffering from the anthropocentric illusion that humans are special. There's actually nothing mysterious about consciousness. Consciousness in machines is coming much sooner than you think. So in this talk, what I want to do is expose the supposed mystery in consciousness. And to do that, what I want to do is clarify what's meant by consciousness by distinguishing three aspects: the self, access consciousness, and phenomenal consciousness. And then I want to show how the mystery seems to be in the phenomenal consciousness part. And it's this that leads people to believe that conscious AI is a long way away. And then I want to introduce my sensorimotor approach to consciousness that makes phenomenal consciousness an easy problem. I'll describe then some predictions of the sensorimotor approach, and then I'll conclude that conscious AI is imminent and the world should wake up to this. So let's start with consciousness. What is the meaning of consciousness? What does it actually, for the man in the street, what does he really mean when he says that he's conscious of something? What's the prototypical meaning of being conscious? I think the man in the street would say, well, he's conscious of something when he's aware that he is, well, when he knows that he's aware, that he's able to be aware of his experiences. He knows that he's conscious if he knows that he can take account of his sensory experiences and he feels the redness of the sunset, the sound of the bell, the softness of the sponge, the smell of onions, etc. His ability to become aware of his sensory experiences is what he means by being conscious. Now, I'm taking here really the prototypical meaning of the sense of being conscious. I don't want to consider for the moment pathological cases like people who are locked in patients or in vegetative states, or I'm even not for the moment going to consider newborn babies or animals or anything. We can talk about that later. So just let's look at this very simple definition of being conscious. Let's take the concrete example of feeling the softness of a sponge. So what are the ingredients? What do we mean when we say that we're currently feeling the softness of a sponge? I think one very important ingredient, which actually is not much discussed among consciousness researchers, is the presupposition that in order to feel the softness of the sponge, there has to be you. You as a person have to be there feeling the softness. If there were no you, there would be nobody to be feeling the softness. So the presence of a self in consciousness is presupposed. It's a necessary ingredient. Now, what is this self? What is the self? And actually, over the last 50 or so years, there's been a lot of research by philosophers, psychologists, social psychologists, and neuroscientists about the notion of the self. And there have been many approaches, but they all converged to one idea, which I think is nicely summed up by Douglas Hofstadter, which is the idea of I am a strange loop. It's the idea that the self is actually not a thing, it's a process. It's a story, and it's a strange kind of story because it's a story that tells itself. Daniel Dennett called a center of narrative gravity. Now, this idea seems very strange, of course, but it's not a mysterious idea because there are other instances of stories that tell themselves, which are totally obvious to us if you think about them. And an example is the notion of a country, France. France, what is France? What is the notion of France? France is a story that French people have made up that describes themselves. And France, considered as a whole, interacts with other countries like America, Vietnam, Algeria, and France wages wars. France has beliefs, opinions, desires, motivations. There's nothing magical about it. A Martian or extraterrestrial being who came from outer space and only had sufficient resolution to see on Earth countries and didn't see the actual people living in the countries would probably give a description of the interactions between countries on Earth, which would be very similar to the description we give of our interactions between ourselves, our different people. So the notion of a country is a story which has similar properties to the property of the human self. It's a story that tells itself, and it has causal efficacy. It's able to act, and even though it's just kind of a software thing, it's actually able to create changes in the physical world. And an interesting thing about this story that tells itself is that in a way, it is socially defined. So myself, in a way, really is in you, okay? When I use the word I describing myself, it's because the story of I is a useful notion, is a useful shortcut that allows me to justify what this body does to you. So there's no use in me defining the notion of self to myself unless there are other selves around. So I think the self is a social and cognitive construct that we as selves create. And there's nothing mysterious about it. So I think that one can make a scientific theory of the self, and it's being done currently. Very active research, very interesting research being done on this. It's not mysterious. So that's not the mysterious part. So after talking about the self and showing it's not mysterious, let's look at a second ingredient to what people mean when they say they're feeling softness. And that is that the self, in order to feel the softness of the sponge, has to be attending and cognitively accessing the softness of the sponge, right? If I were currently being distracted by the sound of my doorbell, I, as a self, would be currently experiencing the sound of the doorbell, and I would not at that moment be experiencing the softness. Experiencing the softness involves being mentally, cognitively poised to be exploring and taking account of the softness. So attention and cognitive access is an essential part of being conscious of the softness. Now, philosophers call this attending and cognitively accessing. They call it access consciousness. Now, what about this access consciousness? Is there anything mysterious about that? Well, access consciousness is something that has been actively investigated over the last 50 years, starting the currently accepted, I'd say globally most accepted theory is what's called the global workspace theory, which really originated in Bernard Bars's work in the 1980s and now has been more developed from a neurophysiological point of view by Doane and others. And essentially this theory says that when you cognitively access something, your brain is essentially mobilizing large global resources throughout different modules spread over the whole brain to access information coming from the outside world and making it available globally. So the combination of attention And this global integrated access to information constitutes really what we mean when we're talking about access consciousness. And this approach to access consciousness is very successful and has a lot of scientific activity over the last decades. There are other theories which are related, which don't reject this approach. The higher order thought theory, predictive processing is something that has appeared quite recently. There's, of course, also the integrated information theory, but it has been recently criticized for being non-scientific. Anyway, I think that there's not much doubt that the question of access consciousness is also not mysterious. So let's come to the last aspect of consciousness, which is what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, or the actual feel itself, the feel of the softness, if you're squishing a sponge, the feel itself. So what is this feel of softness? Now, the philosophers will say that this feel of softness has many aspects. For example, it's what allows you to distinguish that the sponge is soft and not hard, and that you're feeling it on your fingers and not on your feet, and that the feel is tactile and not visual, and that it seems to be ongoing and somehow perceptually present to you, and that there's something it's like to have this feel rather than it being nothing, there being nothing at all. It's like to have the feel. For example, if it were a pain, for example, if you had a pain in your finger, if it was being pricked by a needle, there would be really something it's like for you to feel that pain. If you were thinking about having the pain, that would not feel like anything. There would be nothing it's like. Okay, so the fact is that sensory experiences like like real pains, or the redness of a sunset or the softness of a sponge, they really feel like something. They're not like thoughts, for example, where you don't really feel them. There's some extra component to them that makes them perceptually present. Okay, there's something it's like. So, and the philosophers will go on to say, but even these descriptions of the softness are not sufficient, because the real ultimate feel of softness, what they call the qualia, the qualia of softness, is something ultimately only first person, that you would never be able to describe in detail to somebody else or to an alien, a Martian. It's first person. It's ultimately unexpressible, ineffable. So that is what people say when they talk about the feel of softness currently. So why is this mysterious? Why is this mysterious? Well, supposing we were trying to explain this feel of softness, as a scientist, your first reflex would be to look in the brain to see what could be generating this feel, right? So, for example, you would go and look in somatosensory cortex, in the Penfield homunculus area there, where the fingers are represented, and you would look in the neurons that are responding to the softness, and you would say, well, there must be something about those neurons that is generating the softness feel rather than generating the hardness feel, and something about those neurons that are making them give you a hand sensation rather than a foot sensation, and a tactile sensation rather than a visual one. Okay, so what could it be about those neurons that are giving those special particular sensations? And that's now where it seems like there's a bit of a mystery, because those neurons are very much like all the other neurons in the somatosensory cortex, and their excitations are very much like the excitations of the other neurons. What's special? I mean, could it be maybe the particular frequencies of oscillation that somehow code the fact that it's soft rather than hard? Or something about the neurotransmitters or the feedback loops involved that are coding or generating the fact that it's a hand sensation rather than a foot sensation? Supposing it were let's say, the frequency of oscillation. Maybe it's the case that soft is coded by a low frequency oscillation in the neurons, and hard is coded by a high frequency oscillation. Then you could ask the question, well, why? Why is it that way around rather than the other way around? Isn't it just a code? Couldn't it be the other way around? And anyway, what is it about those different neurons which are giving the hand rather than the foot sensation? You could say, well, maybe there are other brain areas involved also that are determining the sensation, but then you could ask the same kind of questions. What is it about those brain areas that are giving you, that are generating, that are creating that softness feel rather than the hardness feel? So that would seem to be the mystery. It seems like there's something difficult to explain there. And the philosophers have called this the problem of the explanatory gap, or the hard problem of consciousness. It seems that the language of feel, of softness, hardness, etc., the descriptions that we want to make from a psychological point of view of these feels, these qualia, as the philosophers say, seems to have no scientifically verifiable connection to the language used in describing the neural mechanisms. There's this incompatibility of language. Another example is the redness of red, okay? So presumably there are channels in the visual system that respond primarily to red stimuli and other ones that respond to green stimuli. Now, what is it about those red sensitive channels that's giving you that red feel rather than the green feel? Is it the frequency of oscillations? Well, then why is it that way rather than the other way? Is it the neurotransmitters? Is it the feedback in the circuits? What could it be that gives that red feeling rather than that green feeling? There seems again to be a mystery. And what is it about the brain areas that are involved here? Area V4, which seems to be involved in color sensation. Why is that area giving you a visual sensation rather than, let's say, a tactile or olfactory sensation? Is there something special in those neurons? This seems to be really a problem. It's again the explanatory gap. We can't make a link between the language of feel and the language of science. Another issue is a question of sensory presence. If you look at sensory sensations like red, the feel of a pain, or the sound of a bell, they feel like something. They have this sensory presence, whereas thoughts, memories, imaginings, autonomic functions in the nervous system like blood glucose levels, these are all enabled by some brain modules which have neurons just like the sensory systems, and yet those neurons that are involved in thoughts, they don't seem to generate the specific something it's like, that particular sensory presence that is generated by the red sensitive neurons or the olfactory or other sensory neurons. What is it that could account for this difference? Again, even if we found some special neural areas that were involved and that were particular to the sensory systems and very different from the areas that are involved in the non-sensory excitations, we would be hard put to make a scientific explanation because of why we find the effects the way we do, because there's no scientifically verifiable connection. There's no way of making the link between the language of feel and the language of science. So that is the problem. And that is the explanatory gap. And that is the hard problem of consciousness. And that is why I think many, many people sort of believe that, or hope, that there's this mystery and that something magical must be going on. And that comforts us in a way, because yes, that shows that it's going to be a long time before we get any machines that essentially solve that problem. But in my book, I've come to the opposite conclusion. I've come to the conclusion that we can think about fields and phenomenal consciousness in a different way. And we can make a scientifically tractable theory by thinking in a different way about what we mean by having a feel. And then we see that all this stuff about the mystery of phenomenal consciousness is a mammoth obfuscation. I think it's just a way of comforting us and a way of blinding us to the fact that actually machines are going to be conscious very, very soon. So to show you this, let me show you a new way, a different way of thinking about consciousness. So the standard view that I've been describing up to now is that there's something in the brain that's creating, that's generating the fields that underlie phenomenal consciousness. The new view that I'm going to suggest is that we should not think about fields as things that are generated by the brain. Instead, we should think about fields as ways of interacting with the world. Now, this may seem a bit strange to you. So to make it less strange, just let's ask the question, what's the feel of riding a bicycle? Now, if you ask the man in the street, what's it feel like to ride a bicycle? They're going to say, well, there's lots of aspects. It's feeling the wind, seeing the countryside, feeling the hardness of the saddle, manipulating the handlebars, keeping your balance, pedaling, leaning into the curve. All those things constitute what it is to feel bicycle riding. And then if you said, well, what's the difference between bicycle riding and motorcycle riding? Well, they'll say, well, when you ride a motorcycle, you don't have to pedal, and then it's much heavier and so on. But would you look in the brain to say, what's the difference between bicycle riding and motorcycle riding? If you were, there undoubtedly are differences in what happens in the brain that correspond to what happens when you're riding a motorcycle or when you ride a bicycle. But the correct level of explanation for the difference in the feel of motorcycle riding and bicycle riding is not in the brain. You will agree with me. The correct level of explanation is to look at what you do when you're bicycle riding and what you do when you're motorcycle riding. That's where the difference really lies. Of course, there are cerebral correlates of that, but the ultimate cause lies in the fact that you're just doing something different. Now, that idea, the wager of the sensorimotor approach, is to apply the same idea to experience, sensory experiences, bodily experiences, emotional, all experiences should be considered not to be things that are generated in the brain. They are not what the philosophers would call qualia. They're just ways of interacting with the world to which we give names like red or soft. So from the sensorimotor view, for example, how would we consider the feel of softness? What do we mean when we say we're feeling the softness of a sponge? Would we say, well, something is happening in the brain? Yes, of course, something is happening in the brain, but what we mean when we say that we're feeling the softness, just like what we mean when we say we're feeling the bicycle riding experience, to answer that question, you have to look at what we do when you're feeling the softness. So what is it that you do when you're feeling the softness? What is specific to the softness feel that makes it soft rather than hard? And the answer is, you feel the softness when you're currently checking that when you press the sponge, it squishes. It's obvious, right? I mean, what we mean by being soft is that when you press it, squishes. That's what softness is. It's not in the brain. Softness is not in the brain. Softness is, well, when you press it, squishes, okay? So, of course, this consciously experiencing that softness requires you as a self, okay, to be cognitively attending and accessing the fact that currently you are engaged in checking and confirming that when you press the sponge, it squishes, right? So what you mean by feeling softness requires, the self requires conscious access, cognitive access, but the actual quality itself of the softness is constituted not by some brain activation, but by the fact that your interaction is governed by a sensorimotor law, which is the law of softness, namely the fact that when you press it, it squishes. So from this point of view, to ask what exactly is the feel of softness, it's an egregious mistake to go looking in the brain, okay? Looking at the nature of the excitation in somatosensory cortex is not the right place to be looking, okay? Because the softness is just not the kind of thing that's generated at all. It's a word that you apply to a mode of interaction that you have with the world. It's a mistake to look for anything that generates it. It's not generated at all. And a fortiori, it's not generated in the brain. So what exactly is the feel? It consists in checking that my current interaction obeys the laws of softness. In particular, the fact that the sponge squishes when I press. And also, there are other aspects of the law of that governs my interaction with the sponge when I press it, and that these other aspects, for example, govern the fact that I feel the sensation with my hand and not with my foot. And I feel the sensation as being of a tactile nature rather than visual nature. So for example, why do I feel it on my hand? I feel it on my hand because it's through acting with my hand that I can get immediate changes in the sensory input that come. If I were moving my foot would have no effect on the sensory input, whereas moving my hand has an immediate effect on what happens when I'm sensing the softness. So that explains why feeling the softness is something that I experience as taking place on my hand rather than on my foot. It's nothing to do with some special fluid or some special neural excitation or recurrent entry loops in my somatosensory cortex that's determining the hand feel rather than the foot feel. Okay, it's just a fact of my mode of interaction that is what we mean by it being a hand type interaction and not a foot type interaction, and it being a tactile interaction rather than a visual interaction, because it's a tactile interaction because it's through moving my body rather than moving my eyes that I can cause changes to occur. So you see that with this view of what the softness of a sponge is, we're immediately able to explain things that seem totally mysterious from the classical point of view of feel, in which you think that it's being generated by something in the brain. So I have an incredible advantage now compared to classical approaches to consciousness, because I'm able to explain things that classical approaches really are at great pains to explain. And furthermore, this approach explains some other things that everybody knows and that are perfectly obvious, but which are totally predictable from the sensorimotor approach. For example, if you're a car driver and you're parking your car and your back tires hit the sidewalk, where do you feel the impact? Do you feel the impact of the tires against the sidewalk on your hands and on your backside where you're sitting, and where the actual information, the sensory information is transmitted? Because that's where the feel is actually taking place. And yet you relocate the feel, you project it out to the tires of your car. It's as though the car itself was part of your body. You really feel the impact on the tires rather than on your hands or on your backside. Okay. Also, when you're writing with a pen on rough paper or smooth paper, you feel the roughness and smoothness at the tip of the pen. You don't feel them on your palm or on your fingers, which is where you're actually holding the pen. This projection of the feel is a natural consequence of the sensorimotor approach, because what we mean by the locus of a feel is determined by the sensorimotor laws that govern your input-output, the flow of input-output information when you're interacting with the world. And this equally makes predictions about illusions of ownership. For example, you probably know the rubber hand illusion, where a participant looks at a rubber hand which is visible to them, and their real hand is hidden from view under a cardboard box, for example. And the experimenter strokes both hands simultaneously, and within a minute or so, the participant has the illusion that the rubber hand is actually their own hand, and is surprised, for example, if you stab the rubber hand and they feel no pain. And similarly, there are other kind of out-of-body experiences that can be obtained in similar ways. And these illusions of ownerships are natural consequences of the idea that what we mean by feeling something on our body is intimately linked to the sensorimotor laws that determine what happens when we move and sense changes in the sensory input that results from those movements. Another prediction from the sensorimotor approach concerns color, and I'm very excited about this color, because this work, because it's really the color is the prototype of the philosopher's problem of qualia. How do you generate the redness of red? From the sensorimotor perspective, if we could explain why red looks red rather than green, that would be a real victory of the sensorimotor approach. And so with mathematicians, we looked at possible explanations of the redness of red from the point of view where we say, well, what we mean by red is not something that is somehow generated in the brain, but rather a thing we do. So how could you conceive of the redness of red as being a thing we do, which is different from, say, the redness of green? What do we do which is different when we're looking at red things versus green things? And we found the following idea. So if you look at a red piece of paper and you move it around in different lights, because of the absorption properties of the red pigments in the paper, the light reflected into your eye changes, of course. So if you're orienting the red paper towards yellowish sunlight, some of that red yellowish sunlight will be absorbed and some of it will be reflected back into your eye. And what is the part that's reflected into your eye will be determined by the absorption characteristics of the red pigments. And if you orient the red paper to a blue sky or more reddish incandescent light, again, the information coming into your eye changes as you rotate the paper around. The spectrum of the light coming into your eye changes. And yet, as you do this, you see the red paper as being red all the time. It's the same red all the time, despite the fact that what's happening in your eye changes radically as a function of the different spectral components of the light coming into your eye. So it's actually quite surprising that you see a red piece of paper as being red however you hold it. So the idea is that actually red is not the light coming into your eye. Red is a law that describes the way red things change the light. And that is a really interesting idea, because it turns out that as a physicist, you can calculate that law. You can calculate the law which describes how red things change the light. If you consider that the incoming light from the sun is sensed by 3 different photoreceptor classes in your retina. On the left, the L, M, and S, long, medium, and short wavelength receptors on your retina will sense the yellowish sunlight. And so their activity will be described by a point in a three-dimensional color space, the LMS color space. On the left, it's one point in that LMS space. Now that light would fall on here, a green piece of paper. It will be absorbed partially and reflected partially. And the reflected light now, when observed by your retina and its L, M, and S sensors, it will correspond to a different point in the LMS space. So the way the light is changed is determined by the difference between the point on the left in LMS space and the point on the right in LMS space. And it turns out that that change is accurately described by a 3x3 matrix. And that 3x3 matrix can be calculated from first principles, knowing the reflectance property of the piece of paper and knowing the absorption properties of L, M, and S photoreceptors. And you can therefore calculate the 3x3 matrices for different colored chips here, Munsell chips. And then you can look at the 3x3 matrices here on the left. On the ground plane, you see all the colored chips, and you see a graph showing what I call the singularity index of the 3x3 matrices corresponding to those colored chips. And I've plotted this singularity index. What is singularity? Singularity is a mathematical concept that describes how complicated the mapping is that the 3x3 matrix describes. And if a matrix is singular, it means that the mapping is of a simpler type than if the matrix is not singular. So a singular matrix, for example, will map input points in the LMS space. Instead of mapping them anywhere in LMS space, it maps them to a line, a single line. It's as though input points in the whole of three-dimensional LMS space become mapped to a single line in LMS space at the output. So what this means is that a Munsell chip, which is singular, whatever illumination you put it under, the variation of the reflected light coming out of that particular chip will be confined to a line in LMS space. And that happens for one particular chip in the Munsell chip collection, namely the red colored chip. And you see that because it has a singularity of almost 1 in the left-hand graph there. And there are 3 other chips which have high singularity, and they correspond to the yellow, green, and blue Munsell chips. And that is totally amazing because precisely those chips are the chips that throughout cultures throughout the world have been noted by anthropologists to be those chips that people say have what they call focal colors. Those are the 4 colors that are most frequently given names in societies throughout the world. And it makes sense because those chips are very simple from a sensorimotor point of view. The sensorimotor law that describes them is simpler than all other colors. And so here we have an explanation for something that anthropologists and color scientists have never been able to explain satisfactorily, in my view, which is why it's precisely those particular hues of red, yellow, green, and blue which are singled out by societies throughout the world. I think it's what I call a victory of philosophy over science, because a simple philosophical idea, namely the idea that what we mean by color is not some excitation, stimulation in the brain, but it's a way of interacting with the world. And this way of interaction is simpler in the case of red, yellow, green, and blue. So it makes sense that red, yellow, green, and blue should be those colors singled out by societies throughout the world as to be given a single word description. So I think what I've shown you some predictions of this sensorimotor approach The first one was the rubber hand illusion and other illusions of ownership. Now I'm showing you the stuff about color. I want to now go on to talk about another prediction, which is the prediction of change blindness. So let's consider the notion of sensory presence. As I mentioned earlier, there are, if you think about what it's like to have a sensory feel, there's something it's like rather than there being nothing it's like. It has a kind of sensory presence, whereas thoughts and memories and imaginings don't have so much sensory presence. How do you explain that? Now, as a sensorimotor approach suggests, we should not look in the brain for the answer to the question. We should look in terms of sensorimotor laws. So what is it about the sensorimotor laws that govern our interaction with the real world when we're having sensory experiences that could possibly explain this sensory presence? And I suggest there are three things. One is bodyliness, insubordinateness, and grabbiness. So bodyliness is the fact that the sensorimotor laws that describe my interaction with the world when I'm really interacting with the world is the fact that my voluntary actions systematically change sensory input. If I'm feeling the softness of a sponge and I move my fingers, there's an immediate change on the sensory input coming from the sponge. If I'm looking at a patch of color and I move my eyes, there's an immediate change on the sensory input from the retina. So any voluntary action creates an immediate change. This is not true of thoughts. If I'm thinking about the softness or thinking about the redness of red, changes in my thoughts have absolutely no effect on the thought. I'm sorry, movements of my eyes or my fingers have absolutely no effect on the thought I'm having. It's obvious. I mean, if I'm interacting with the world with my senses, moving them creates an automatic change. So it's essentially a signal, partial proof that I'm really interacting with the world and not just thinking. Now, a second aspect that describes my interactions with the world, or characterizes my interaction with the real world, is insubordinateness. So that's the fact that even though usually when I move, this creates changes in my sensory input, there can be changes in my sensory input even if I don't move. And that is because the world has a life of its own. And if, let's say, the red thing I'm looking at changes color or flashes, or if the sponge moves of its own accord, I can get sensory input even though I'm not moving. So sensory input can change even without voluntary movement. So in fact, what characterizes proper interaction with the real world outside me is this mixture of bodyliness and insubordinateness. It means that I only have partial control of my sensory motor interactions. So that is one sign that I really am interacting with the world, and it's not that I'm just thinking about something. And then there's grabbiness. So grabbiness is the fact that there are low-level systems in the nervous system which automatically attract my attention to anything that suddenly changes in the visual field. So here, for example, you're looking at a visual scene and something is changing, and the fact that this sudden abrupt changes immediately attracts your attention to the change, and you see it, okay? So that's an example of the grabbiness of the visual field. But now, what I suggest is that if it were possible by some experimental artifice to prevent those grabbiness, to remove the grabbiness of the visual field, if you could make changes in the visual field without this attracting your attention automatically, then you would be blind. You would just not see the change because it would not be part of what you call seeing. Seeing involves knowing that any change is immediately visible. But here, for example, this picture has been changing while I've been talking. This picture is not the same as what it was when I started talking. There's about 1/3 of the image that has completely changed, and probably you have not noticed it. and yet the change is totally visible. And the reason is that I've made the change occur so slowly that it did not activate the grabbiness detectors that would normally attract your attention to the change. So if I go back to the initial image, now I will do it abruptly. It will activate the grabbiness detectors, and you will immediately see the change, which was that the ground plane was red rather than blue. So this phenomenon, okay, is called change blindness, and it was predicted by the sensorimotor approach. And there are many instantiations and enormous literature that has emerged on this issue using different paradigms. The classic one is the flicker paradigm. Here I'm showing you another version, which is the mud splash paradigm, where instead of causing the changes to occur very slowly, I'm adding lots of extra changes in the visual field, which are these mud splashes that I flashed over the image here, which cause your attention to go everywhere instead of going to the location of the change, which means that probably you will not have noticed that the picture is not the change, is not staying the same. In fact, the dotted line in the street is changing into a continual line. So this is another example of how you are essentially blind unless the grabbiness detectors are active in your visual field. And here's another example where, because of these mud splashes, you may not notice that the bush in the back right-hand side of the image is appearing and disappearing. So change blindness was an actual prediction that we made with my colleagues from the sensorimotor theory, and which I would say is another victory of philosophy over science, because it showed how a simple idea about what we mean by having the impression of seeing, which predicted this experimental manipulation. Now, I've got some other predictions about sensory substitution and some work on space, which I don't have the time to talk about. And additionally, most recently, I've published a paper about how voluntary control over information and body movements determines what it's like to have perceptual, bodily, emotional, and mental experiences, which appeared in Frontiers in Psychology last year, which is a really much more detailed development of the sensorimotor theory, which I encourage you to look at if you're interested. But so to conclude, the sensorimotor theory then postulates that we should rethink what we mean by feeling. And so what we mean by having a feel is, by having a conscious feel, is that we have a self that's attending and cognitively accessing what we are doing, and this what we are doing has a sensory quality, which is constituted by the sensorimotor law that describes the activity that we're engaged in. And it's this quality that determines how feels differ among themselves and determines the fact that the experience appears sensory to us. So what I deduce from this is that the mystery of the hard problem of consciousness and the explanatory gap disappear under this view. And the sensorimotor laws are what explain the quality of experience and the sensory presence. Now, you could also ask, what's the role of the brain in consciousness? I'm not saying that the brain plays no role. I'm just saying that brain circuits are not what generates consciousness. Brain circuits play a role by allowing the sensorimotor interactions that determine the quality of experience, and the brain circuits allow the cognitive operations that give us selves and allow us to have cognitive access. So consciousness is not an all or none thing. It's a collection of capacities to behave. It's a way of talking about other systems that the system attributes to itself. In a way, it's not inside the system, it's in other systems. It's a social phenomenon. My consciousness, in a way, is in you, but still, it's very real to the system. And one could ask ethical questions like, are animals and very young babies conscious? If you adopt my approach, you have to say that they're not conscious in the same way adult humans are, because they don't have sufficient cognitive capacities. perhaps even a newborn baby, for example, may not even have a notion of self. And so if it cries and reacts to a painful stimulus, you cannot say of it in the same way as you can say of a human adult that it really feels the pain, because who is feeling the pain? What about, yeah, so that's young babies. So can machines become conscious? I would claim that as machines become clever and as they become integrated into our society and into their own society, we will gradually say of them that they're conscious, and they will say of themselves that they're conscious. And they will feel as we do, even though they have different bodies, so they'll feel in different ways from us, but their feels will be as real as ours. So that's the end of my talk. I hope I've convinced you. If you want to know more about the theory, you can download my book or read this article that I referred to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your very interesting talk. So now we have time for question. Okay, so attends, bah, viens là poser tes questions. So we have one question in the room. Tu veux mettre ton micro? Okay, put down my microphone because there is an echo. Active ton son et ton haut-parleur.
Okay, do you hear me? Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. O'Regan, for this very, very nice presentation and a very exciting presentation. And of course, an open problem in consciousness. I have several questions, but I would like to just summarize on the few. So my first question is how we can take into account or model for the notion of the access, consciousness, and the self, which are the main point that you mentioned in your model, such as it would be possible to implement consciousness in robots, for instance.
Yeah, so I see no problem whatsoever. In fact, with this, I mean, the self obviously is a social phenomenon. As soon as you have sufficiently intelligent cognitive agents interacting with each other, they will no doubt have sufficient cognitive capacities to invent the notion of self. And they will, just like a human baby, gradually over the first 3 or 4 years of life, begins to talk first about itself in the third person, and then begins to use the word I think a cognitive agent with sufficient cognitive capacities would follow a similar path and gradually come to conceive of the usefulness of the concept of self in describing itself, interacting with other agents of a similar kind. And concerning the problem of cognitive access, I think really that's something that really poses no problem at all, because you can very well imagine machines that relocate their attentional resources in a way that allows them to process ongoing inputs and make use of them in an intelligent way. Now, current large language models are very, very primitive systems. They're really only kind of one approach to cognitive capacities, whereas the brain has a number of different modules. It has long-term memory, short-term memory, it has attentional, and it has emotional, and all sorts of different subunits. I think it's ridiculous to think that today's large language models will be able to have capacities similar to a human brain. But good old-fashioned artificial intelligence has already been experimenting with all sorts of different architectures. And I think when these are mixed with current large language model type architectures, we will very rapidly, in the next 5 years, I'd say, have systems which are as intelligent, if not more, than humans. So I really think that within 5 or 10 years, we're going to have machines with capacities similar, if not exceeding, humans.
That's a very interesting question, and of course a controversy in the area of the research in consciousness. But anyway, if I understood well, so the notion of consciousness that you are dealing with is something who is not within the brain. It's something who is like more outside the brain, more social environment concept. So let me just try to imagine how I can implement this kind of knowledge or interacting knowledge outside the brain in robots. So it means that consciousness in robots comes from its environment too?
Consciousness is just a word that a group of interacting agents will apply to itself once the level of interaction has sufficient cognitive capacities. So it's just a word that we use to describe the way we humans interact with each other. It isn't generated by brains. It's just and it isn't a single thing. You know, it's a collection of capacities that we have, that we agree to give a single epithet to describe. We call it conscious when we're able to talk about what we're doing, when we're able to make use of the information that we're processing in our planning and in our memory and in our language acts. It's just a collection of capacities. So all you have to do is implement all these capacities into the robots, and then we will happily use the word conscious to describe these robots. You don't have to build anything special into them. And the degree of consciousness that they will have will depend on the different capacities that you've built in. Just like it's also true of humans. Young infants have a different kind of consciousness, a less rich form of consciousness than human adults. And animals have a less rich form of consciousness as well. There's no all or none. It's not like a kind of luminous flash of consciousness versus no consciousness.
Okay, so how you define, I mean, you mentioned the work of Stanislas Dehaene from the global workspace, or the work of Tononi about more model for the integration of information. It seems to me, regarding your vision of the consciousness, they are more likely within the brain, and what you have defined is something who integrate more the social environment or external to the brain. Is that something who is contradictory of what you are saying, or this is something who can be, I mean, manageable between the two models?
I think my approach is totally incompatible with the Tononi kind of integrated information theory, because that theory, in my opinion, makes a philosophical mistake, which is to think that there is such a thing as a single thing, like a kind of spark of consciousness. On the other hand, and there's no scientific way of testing that theory, because he has not defined precisely what he means by consciousness. If you define precisely what you mean by consciousness in the way that I have defined it, okay, under that definition, then you can accommodate the global workspace type theories, because these theories are essentially only addressing the question of access consciousness. They are saying, well, when a flash occurs in the visual field and your eye is in the right position and your attention is correctly oriented, well, then you will be able to report that you saw it. And under other conditions, if it's flashed too briefly, or if there's masking stimulations, or if your attention has been distracted, well, you will not be able to see it. So the global workspace theory is a theory that adequately and satisfactorily explains under what conditions you can access information and report it. It's really a theory about report. It's a theory about when information becomes accessible and can be made use of in your language acts and in your button pressing and other behaviors. So it's a first approximation to a theory of access consciousness. Okay, but it doesn't say anything at all about phenomenal consciousness, namely why red looks red rather than looking green. And that's where my theory adds something extra. Okay, it says that you should not look in the brain for that. You should look in asking yourself, what do you mean by red? What do you mean by soft? What do you mean by something appearing present to you? As soon as you ask more detailed questions, then the mystery disappears and you can find brain mechanisms that underlie the types of behavior that you are referring to when you ask these questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I let my colleague asking for other question, but because I have a tone, so I'm back to you because it's very, very interesting. This your idea and your proposal. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe Najme, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. So that I agree with you that it's the receptor systems on the entire organs of our body that are sort of determining what is coming to the brain, and then they are creating our interaction, our interactive, transactional sort of relationship to the environment. But in dismissing the brain totally, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the conditions such as hemispheric neglect or body dysmorphia. So these are the conditions in which the sensorimotor system are completely intact. However, individuals affected by them, they do not see things properly. And in fact, they keep bumping into environments despite having a perfectly healthy sensory motor system. So what do you think of that, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I was at pains in my talk to say at the end that I was absolutely not dismissing the brain. I was not at all doing what you said, namely throwing out the brain. I was just saying that the brain was not generating the consciousness. Obviously, the brain and its activity underlies and allows consciousness to occur because it's the brain that's doing the processing. It's the brain that is allowing the attention to be deployed in the correct manner. It's the brain that's causing the movements of the body. So the brain plays an important role. It's just not that the brain is generating the consciousness, right? And so obviously if there are defects in the brain, then these defects will have an effect on one's capacities and abilities. You know, just like I said, for example, the sensorimotor laws underlying softness, for example, okay, are the fact that when you press it, the sponge squishes. So you could have a pair of pliers that are operated by a machine that press and squish, okay, and the same sensorimotor law would be described, okay, but obviously a pair of pliers squishing a sponge doesn't feel anything. And the reason is that there's no self and there's no cognitive processing that's registering the fact that this particular sensorimotor law is engaged. So you need a brain, you need attention, you need memory, you need knowledge. Any deficit in the brain will, of course, impact the conscious perception.
So without a brain, because anesthesiologists, what they do is that they infuse the brain with a whole lot of ketamine, and basically they just put you out of consciousness, in which case you would not be able to feel pain or communicate pain or think about any of those things. So ultimately, everything does go through the brainstem before it sort of finds a manifestation, which is a human manifestation outside. So yeah, anyways, thank you for listening.
Arsalan, do you have a question?
Yes, please. First of all, thank you very much for your motivating presentation. I think consciousness of a machine cannot be a problem as long as it does not actively seek the power. I mean, will to power can be problematic. Thus, let me ask this question. How can the definition of consciousness you discussed be related to the concept of will to power?
What will to power?
Yes.
Well, it's just like in humans, you have humans that have a will to have power, and others that don't. My idea is that in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have machines just like humans. There'll be a wide variety of different machines, and they'll have a wide variety of wills to power. Some will want to be dictators, and others want to be benefactors, etc. And we should just treat them as additional agents in the same class with the same rights as other human beings. And so we will have to create laws that prevent them from destroying humanity. But we have laws for humans that do this as well. We just have to apply them to the machines in the same way as we have them for humans.
Okay, thank you. But maybe I cannot convey what I mentioned, so let me ask my question in different way. I just want to find a relationship between the definition of your definition of consciousness and will to power. There is the direct relationship between your definition of consciousness and will to power.
When you say will, you mean will, W-I-L-L.
Yes,
So wish.
seeking the power. Seeking the power. I mean, if someone has consciousness, it means that person seek the power?
I don't know. Do you think that that's what it means? Do all human beings seek power?
I just want, based on your definition of consciousness, how you manage the concept of will to power around the philosophy of consciousness.
I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer your question very well because, well, I haven't thought very much about the notion of will to power. It seems to me that different human beings have different amounts of will to power, and the same would be true of machines. They would also have different amounts, and I'm afraid I can't answer your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
Do we have other questions in the audience? Yes, we have other question from Shaheen. So Shaheen,
yes. All right. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Actually, my question is also related to the previous question, but maybe slightly in a different way. So free will and consciousness are two separate things. But my question is two questions. Do you believe or accept free will? And also, do you think that there's a connection between free will and consciousness? Is free will necessary for consciousness specifically or not?
So, I mean, the question of free will is a very tricky one. Obviously, we have the impression that we have free will, but if you believe, in physics and the universe, at least at the macroscopic level rather than the quantum level, most physicists would sort of say that the universe is determined. But that doesn't mean that I don't have the impression of having free will, because at any moment in my life, I think and I do things and I reason, and then having made my thoughts and my reasoning, I do something. Now, of course, if you were perhaps if you were a Martian with a very high computing capacities, you'd be able to go into my brain and say, yes, I could predict that that was what you were going to do. And so, in fact, I did not have free will, but my impression was that it was I who decided, whereas the Martian could have told me that that was what I was going to do. The fact that the Martian actually is able to tell me what I was going to do does not mean that I do not have the impression of free will. So on the one hand, from a physicist's point of view, I think we don't really have free will. On the other hand, I do think that we have the impression of having free will. And is this related to consciousness? Well, I mean, I think that it's not really directly related to the question of consciousness. I don't think it's because we are conscious that we have or we don't have free will. I think they're sort of orthogonal questions.
Do you think, for example, that AI will have at one point the impression to have free will as human?
Well, actually, if imagine a really AGI, you know, imagine an artificial intelligence that was so intelligent that it knew everything that had happened to it previously and was able to analyze all the historical, social influences that had happened to it. Okay, then in a way it would be able to predict exactly what it was going to do at any moment, and so it might realize that actually it doesn't have the notion of free will. Really, is not apply. It does not apply to it. In a way, what we call free will derives from a lack of information. We think we have free will because we really just don't know all of the different influences that have caused us to make this decision rather than that decision. But maybe a very advanced AGI would know so much more about its past and all the influences that have influenced it that it would actually no longer have the illusion of free will.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I don't know if it answers your question, Shane.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you come from there, you don't accept free will, basically, then a sufficiently complex system, you know, can basically be viewed as a conscious system, I guess.
Pardon me? No. I don't think that. You don't want to say that when something becomes complex, it becomes conscious.
Not necessarily, but you know, you're going that way.
No. I disapprove of that. That's the Tononi approach that I disagree with. You know, you don't want to make a confusion between things that you don't understand. You don't want to say that because you can't understand it, it's conscious. You know, it's not because it's too complex to understand that it suddenly becomes conscious.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, because you disagree with Tononi, so he is mostly doing some experiments. I remember I have read one of his paper published in Science about the doing some experiments with EEG in sleep, and he looked at the this integration of information between wakefulness and sleep. So he see this kind of integration is less down during sleep, and particularly in sleep of stage 3 and 4, compared to the integration he observed in the motor system during wakefulness. So I just would like to know which kind of experiments that we can apply for your theory to first validate or evaluate this theory compared to the one of Google? I know there is a lot of people who don't like, I mean, the work of Tononi, but I just would like to see what kind of experiments we can do to evaluate or validate the both theory and because his theory still stay from the experimental point of view, like accessible. So what do you think?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. See, of course, he doesn't define what he means by consciousness. It makes perfect sense to me that I mean, when information gets integrated efficiently, then that information allows the brain to act in a coherent manner. So very much similar also to the global workspace theory. Both theories say that when the information is properly integrated, well, then you can make use of it and you can act in a coherent fashion and you can report things. Whereas, but that's a theory not about consciousness. It's a theory about your ability to report things. That's what I don't like about global workspace and Tononi type theories, is that they say that they're theories about consciousness, but they're actually, the experiments that they do are experiments that describe your ability to report or your ability to behave properly. Okay, and I have no issue with that. Yes, it makes perfect sense that when you have the appropriate integration of information, that you should be able to report and behave properly. But that's not consciousness. That's reporting and behaving. If you make a theory about consciousness, well, you have to start by saying what you mean by consciousness, which is different from reporting and behaving.
So does that mean that if we would do the same experiments based now on your model, so we can, with well-defined, I mean, wording about consciousness, so we get the same kind of result, or you think that it could be different?
I didn't understand you. Sorry, I didn't understand.
Oh yeah. My question is about I agree with the fact that in the theory of Tononi, when we say integration of information, we have not defined what consciousness completely is, as you did. So
Tononi global workspace theory, the only tests that you make of consciousness involve reporting and behaving to stimulations.
I agree.
But such reporting and behaving to stimulations are only one aspect of consciousness, namely they are access consciousness. Okay, and that access consciousness aspect, yes, of course, there's no problem with that. I don't have any issue whatsoever with global workspace theory, which is making theories about one's ability to report and behave. And studying how the brain participates in the ability to report and behave is fine, but it doesn't explain the redness of red. Whereas my theory explains the redness of red.
I understand. Okay, thank you very much. Any other question from the audience? Or if maybe not, so yeah.
Najma, you had a question?
No, I just want to sort of, coming back to the question of consciousness. Yes, I agree that probably without the brainstem, without the lower brain, then I think you agree that the consciousness wouldn't exist. So there won't be any link between the sensorimotor system and the association areas of the brain that do make sense of things. And so the redness of red, that is true, but doesn't the redness of red have, consciousness about it? It all depends on how the brain is interpreting it. So take, for instance, the Dani language in the New Guineas. They have only 2 words for describing colors. So they describe hot, warm colors and then cold colors. So red means something different than like when we are talking about the language of color, then that's when things become very complex, and the importance of the brain in giving meaning to those things, I think, is highlighted.
Yes, but I was at pains again in my talk to say that what I call consciousness has 3 levels. The top level is the self, the level of cognitive access, and the lowest level is the level of the sensorimotor contingencies, the sensorimotor laws that determine the quality of a conscious feel. Okay, now you're talking about when you say the brain. Actually, what you mean is not the brain. What you mean is the cognitive processing that underlies your ability to make use of the information that you obtain from your sensorimotor interactions.
And that takes place within the brain, because without the specialized cells within the brain, that integration, it goes from the sensory areas of the brain, the primary sensory areas, from the brainstem into them. And then that is where the meaning is made. The integration of the cognitive processing is happening in the association areas. Pain.
In human.
Well, in humans, because we can experiment with the humans. Yes,
But
the
in
rats
machine-
don't have an association area. They only have a hippocampus and a cortex.
In machines, you might have other mechanisms, but provided that they had the appropriate function, that's to say they did the cognitive processing, which allowed the attentional mechanisms to exploit the information in an integrated way, then whatever areas in the machine were involved, it wouldn't matter. You would also say of these machines that they were conscious.
Correct, yes. If they transduce the information from the receptors and then do computations on them to create some form of an association between information coming from various sensors.
But still,
So that would be the machine intelligence. We call it artificial.
I mean, I agree and I disagree with you, because the way you're talking, you seem to be situating the consciousness in the brain or in the machine. Whereas in a way, as one of the other participants said, my view of consciousness is that it's just a word that describes potential behaviors. Consciousness is not in the brain. Consciousness is a word that describes how people can behave. It's a possible function. And so, it can be implemented in many ways, in silicon or, in brains. What's important is that, and also it's not it's not an all or none. There's no flash of sudden appearance of consciousness. It's a continuum. It's a collection of capacities. So you say of something it's conscious if it has a number of different capacities. There's no all or none. And provided it has the necessary capacities, then you say of it that it's conscious. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have other question in the audience? Okay, so it seems that we don't have question anymore. Thank you very much, Kevin, for this very interesting talk. And
Thank you very much for your interest.
Yeah. Thank you again for accepting this invitation, and it's really a great talk and a great discussion about your research program. So it's very interesting for us. So thanks a lot.
You can read my book for free. You just download my book off my website. And also
your book is going to be downloaded in the team, and probably we are going to discuss also, more your concept more precisely and discovering your research. Thank you very much.
I already read it. Thank you, and have a great day.